Hello Patreons and welcome to my tutorial on how to draw ocean sunset in coloured pencils. Now this one is half of this original artwork where the bottom half had sea lines, but I'm just going to focus on the top half where I've got the sunset. Now I start off with cold grey 4 and just blocking in where the darker clouds are at the top. I'm just doing light layers and just not being too careful on staying within the lines that I've sketched out. The clouds can be quite random shapes, so it doesn't matter if you're not quite doing it exactly as you'd planned. And I'm just very roughly blocking that in, not stressing too much about complete coverage at this moment. Mostly just focusing on with the reference photo where the darker areas are and the lighter areas are, just getting them in place. Once you've got those in, it's a lot easier to figure out what's what in your artwork. And that goes for other types of artworks when you're doing like animals and stuff. A lot of the time it is good to block in some of the darker areas so that when you're working on, say, fur, you know what area is going to be dark and what's light already, because you've already got the darker areas locked in. Now I'm going over a cold grey 2 and just doing a solid layer over the whole of the top area. Sorry about the blurriness right there. I'm not pressing very hard with the pencil. I am keeping it as a light layer and just making sure that there's a fair amount of coverage, but again, not being very neat with my pencil strokes at all. Just darkening up those little shadowed areas in the clouds. One thing with clouds is they do tend to have quite a horizontal sort of pattern, and that's something to make sure that you pay attention to when you are drawing clouds. Is that even though they might be fluffy and billowy, they still have a lot of horizontal lines to it. Like the base of the cloud is often can have quite a strong horizontal line, and you just got to make sure that you capture some of that. So if you look at the lines that I've got sketched out, you can see most of them are quite horizontal, and that's where I'm putting in like the different layers of the clouds as they go further back. And just using a bit of sky blue there to get a touch of blue in, and just adding more and more layers. Just going over with the same greys, just building up that darker area, making sure there's enough pigment on the paper before I blend it out. My camera was having a little bit of difficulty staying focused on the page at this moment. Every time I moved my hand, it wanted to follow my hand. A bit frustrating. Sorry about that. Now just using the black Polychromos pencil and just having neater strokes now. You see I'm doing little circles and just building up that dark shadowed area on that cloud. And now I'm starting to define the shapes a bit more with the pencils rather than just being quite loose with the strokes. At this point, I'm not too worried about keeping my pencil sharp. I'm not doing really fine detail. Just getting the pigment onto the paper. If you weren't using an odorless solvent, you'd probably want to keep your pencils a lot sharper because you'd be trying to get the pigment into those little white specks of the paper. But I use the odorless solvent to do that, so I don't need to keep the pencil as sharp for this sort of work. Here I'm starting to blend out with the odorless solvent. And now that's my number 8 Taklon filbert brush, and I'm just dipping it in the odorless solvent and then wiping off the excess and then using it on the paper. And just using it to smudge all the pigment around and into the white parts of the paper where the texture of the paper stops the pencil from going into. On this layer, I'm being a bit liberal with the amount of solvent, using a bit more than I usually would, just because it was being a bit more difficult to blend with the solvent, which meant that I probably needed to have even more layers of pencil on there. That's a good guide as to whether you've got enough layers on the page, is how easy it is to blend. If it is really hard to blend and the pigment doesn't seem to want to move very easily, then you need more pigment and more layers on the page. Now onto the next lot of layers, and just going with the cold grey too. Just going a full complete layer over that whole area. I'm just adding a bit more blue in with the sky blue. Just, between the dark clouds, sometimes you just get that little hint of blue. It's not blue sky, but it sort of shines through the thinner layers, so you get a tinge of blue. And now using mauve to just add a bit of purple in onto that cloud. I am keeping the pencil going in tight circles and not letting my strokes go in all sorts of directions. Sometimes it looks like I'm scribbling, but I am actually keeping the pencil strokes in tight little circles. At this point, sometimes your pencil strokes will actually show through to the final layer, so you do want to start having a bit more control over your pencil strokes. I do find that my pencil strokes, even though I'm doing them in circles, they do all have a slight slant to them, and that can be seen throughout the picture, but I don't think it really matters as much as if like the pencils were going in all sorts of random directions, or if they all had a strange slant which was different to each circle next to it. That would have a bigger issue on the final picture. Using the black pencil to add a bit more definition to these clouds along the edges, and getting in some of those little tiny shadows on the clouds. As you can see, this took a lot longer than what the short video on YouTube showed it to be. Colour pencil work can be quite slow at times. Now, this particular video has been quite successful on YouTube, which is why I'm doing it as a hour-long tutorial. I figured if people like the really short version, then that people might be interested in seeing the longer version as well. So hopefully you guys are enjoying it. Now on to blending it out again, and this is the second time of blending. And I'm being a bit more careful with how I'm doing the brush strokes this time. I am keeping them into the shadowed areas and not going to be drawing them over into light areas as much as I did before. Just because you don't want, especially when I'm getting up to the blacker areas, you don't want to be drawing that over to the light area next to it, because you do want to keep that contrast. And if you smear the black over the lighter area, you'll lose that contrast. And if you have been using your brush on a dark area, make sure to dip it back in the solvent and swish it around, and that'll actually clean the brush and get rid of a lot of the pigment. If you're finding pigment is still on your brush after doing that, you'll need to use some paper towel to brush the pigment off, and that's important to do if you're doing it on a really light area and switching between a dark area to a light area. Sometimes the pigment stays in the brush and you can actually get the wrong color in the wrong area as a result of that. Now onto some color. Now, I'm not quite sure which colors I used here because I did this video quite a while ago, but I will include a list of the pencils I used, and I used quite a lot of oranges and pinks and reds. I've been using permanent carmine, madder, rose carmine, there's pale geranium lake as well. So just adding a little tinge of that pink onto those clouds, just so that the dark clouds mesh well with the brighter clouds, which will come in the next layer below them. Otherwise, the grey clouds will sort of not look quite right. They'll be separated from the bright colours that's about to come on the next section. As you can see, just adding more layers of grey and just making sure that there's enough colour on that area. Using black to define those shadows again. And that is how you work with colored pencils, is you just keep building up the layers until you get it to the way it looks that you're happy with. It's never a matter of just doing one layer and having it look perfect. You just keep adding the layers, and the more colors and layers you put in, the better it looks, because you can't really portray it so much through the computer, because when you take a photo of the picture, it really doesn't capture how the artwork looks in real life. But you can see all those different layers, and the way the light goes through those layers when you're looking at it, it does make a difference when you use lots of layers as opposed to just a few. And you never have the perfect colored pencil that gets it exactly right. And just blending it out once again. As you can see, I'm actually using way too much solvent on the brush at the moment. I actually smeared some of that black around, and that's what you don't want to do. And that's when you know you're using too much solvent. It can kind of work in clouds because they're quite random shapes, so it doesn't really matter if you mess it up a little bit. But for animals and people and other things where it's quite distinct what you're trying to draw, you don't want to be using too much solvent because that will mess up your layers. I mean, you can just go on top and keep layering it until it looks okay again, but yeah, it's better if you watch the amount of solvent you got on the brush first. And now onto the coloured part, the bright orange area. So in this area I'm using dark cadmium orange and just sketching in the dark lines and the clouds. I'm using quite a lot of horizontal lines in this section, and I'll do that from here until to the bottom of the artwork of the sunset, because clouds do tend to have a lot of those horizontal lines which I mentioned before, and you want to make sure that you get that effect. And if you're doing vertical lines, it just won't look right, whereas if you've got a lot of horizontal lines, then it looks like those clouds. You can see the different layers of the clouds as they go towards the horizon. And adding some more color into those grey clouds. And those clouds will most likely come back and adjust as I go along as well. And here I'm adding just the base layer of, I'm not sure which pink this is. It might be rose carmine. Not sure, one of the lighter pinks. And just, I am being quite rough with how I'm sketching it in. I'm doing a very light layer, but just trying to get an even coverage across the whole page of that section. And it doesn't matter I'm being a bit rough with that one because I'll be doing lots of layers on top of that. I just need that base layer down. And coming in with the dark cadmium orange again, just making sure I've got a nice dark layer. And just going over some of those spots again. Here I'm using a lighter orange. Maybe that's the dark cadmium orange and the other one was one of the reds. Oh, I'm not sure now. I should have pulled out all the pencils to actually compare. But yeah, I'll give you the full list of the pencils I used. I've got the list here, I just don't know which one's which. I don't really pay attention when I'm drawing as to what pencil I'm using. I'm just grabbing the one that looks right and feels right. Now that one will be dark cadmium yellow. And then just sketching it in and making sure I've got a nice base layer of that yellow. As you can see, you can't really see any of those lines that I started with and where they went. I just got rough, darker spots and lighter spots, and that's what I'm working with. I'm adding in some of the greys now, and that helps draw the grey from those top clouds into these lower layers as well. Because while the sunset's quite bright, it also has quite a lot of greys in it as well. And sketching in some of the shadowed areas on those clouds, not the further away clouds. And again, making sure that there's a lot of horizontal lines built into those clouds. with all artwork with colored pencils, they always go through a stage where they look really bad. As you can see, this does not look good at all. The layer just, there's not enough layers down, and you just look at it and go, what is going on? But it will come good. It will. You just got to keep your faith. You know what you're doing. And if not, you just keep trying. I find the layers usually tend to look really bad until after you've blended it at least once. And then usually it still looks a bit bad until you've done some more layers, but the first blending makes a big difference. Now just blending it out. And I'll be using quite a lot of the solvent on the brush for this layer, just to help make it blend a bit easier. I found with this piece that using the bigger brush for blending was, it helped a lot with my speed of doing this artwork. If you're using a smaller brush, it will take a lot longer to do the blending layers. However, the bigger brushes do tend to hold a lot more solvent than the smaller brushes, and that can be a bit tricky because it'll put a lot more on the paper than you might be expecting it to. Just going to see the solvent changes the color of those yellows quite a lot, makes them a lot brighter than what they were before. I find it quite interesting how the solvent works on different colors. Some colors the color stays the same. Other ones the color seems to mute a bit or lose its brightness. But then colors like these oranges and yellows, look how bright it's making it. It changes it completely, and that's something to keep in mind as well. And sometimes it's always good to practice on a scrap piece of paper if you don't know how the color's going to react under a solvent. Just practice on a piece of paper that you got lying around. I always have a piece next to me just in case I want to test something out or layer in a certain way and see what it does. Because it's always good to practice on a different piece of paper than your actual artwork. Now this one would be either red violet or purple violet. And just doing a nice layer over that top grey area just to bring in those colours a bit more up there. With all artwork, I always find that you might finish a section, but then you always go back and alter it as you go. As you put more areas in, you have to go back and change and just add little things like adding extra colour to areas where you've already worked on. Keeping really small brush pencil strokes in the lower area of the sky as well, because the clouds do not appear as fluffy and billowy because they're further away. So I'm using smaller pencil strokes just to keep them looking a bit better. I think that blue's industrial blue. I'm just doing some of the shadows with that blue rather than the black. Just, black's good, but sometimes you just have to add in other colors into your shadows so that you don't just get a straight black. And also, black tends to look a bit funny when it's used near yellow as well. Not entirely sure why it does that. It's something I found. I'm just following those lines that I sketched in with the grey earlier. I'm just adding in those darker shadows on those clouds. And now coming over with a nice warm pink. I'm doing a very rough layer over the whole section of the top part. And that's a very light layer, as you can tell by how far back I'm holding the pencil. I'm not pressing very hard at all. I'm just adding a nice layer of pigment over that area. Now doing the same with some orange further down. It'd be so easy at this stage to just get discouraged at what's happening and where you're going with this picture because it doesn't look like it's amounting to what you'd want it to do. But you just got to keep going. You got to keep layering. The artwork always looks terrible for a while. I'm adding in a lot of the yellow. I think I was pressing a little bit harder with that, but not very much, just a bit to get a bit of a heavier layer of pigment. And then blending it out. Still using quite a lot, as you can see it drying on the page where it's reflecting from the light. The camera's having a lot of issues today with staying focused. Now this piece was actually my first attempt at doing a sunset in colored pencils, so I'm actually really proud of how well it turned out. I've done another one since then, which was the Frisian horse galloping on the sunset beach. That was a bit of a different sunset. That was more pinks and more of a gloomy sky than this one. The landscape just in front that I'm sketching around will all be black silhouetted once it's finished. So it'll be really nice contrast, and sometimes it's hard to judge your values of the sunset when you've got this big white area beneath it, but especially when it's going to be black afterwards. And if you find that is an issue, just start putting a light layer of black down over that area. You will have to watch it smudging into the sunset area though, if you do that. And you can just put a piece of tracing paper under your hand so that you're not smudging it with your hand. As you can see, it's starting to get that really vibrant yellow orange look. I still got a ways to go. So even though this is sped up, it's still not real time. It's still a lot faster than what I was actually drawing it in. Now using black to add in some shadows. And I found that once you start adding the really darker shadows into the clouds, it made them look a lot better. It changed the way, the atmosphere of it a bit. As you can see, even though I did that in black, it's still coming up grey rather than black. And that's just because I did a light layer of black. I didn't do a heavy-handed layer. Keeping those brush strokes with when I'm blending horizontal as well. So you don't want the black going in all directions. You want to make sure that those lines stay horizontal, because if you do brush strokes vertical, you will actually smear the black into vertical lines and you will see those brush strokes. Next layer of colour, and just keeping this one light and getting a decent coverage over the areas where I want it to be a bit more vibrant. I found that middle section where it's more pink was having a bit more issues coming up as that vibrant colour than the lower area was. So I decided to add a lot more colour. Just keep building the layers until it gets the vibrant colour that you want it to be. And going over the black with those that colour to make the black less black and less grey. You want the shadowed areas to actually have colour in it. And this one I'm pressing a bit harder than I was for the previous layer, just to get a good coverage of that pencil on there. I'm still not pressing hard. It's still light pressure, but it's a bit harder than the previous layers. Now to blend that all out. as you can see, I keep going back to those top grey clouds. They weren't finished. Keep adjusting them and fixing them up, adding more colours and blending the lower layers into them as well, which is another important thing to do. Because sometimes if you don't overlap the blending, you can see where you've done different sections. Sometimes it's not obvious, other times it is. So if you find that the sections are looking like you've done them at two different times, then try just using, when you're blending, to just overlap a little bit. It also means you need to work on matching the colours of the different areas and drawing the colours from one area into the other one a little bit. And just keep blending it out. This is quite a large picture, so that's why it's actually taken me quite a fair bit of time to blend out the whole area. I've got a feeling I actually videoed this with my phone, which is why it's doing that weird focus issue. And that's what I used for all my older videos, was actually the camera on my phone, which I found people are often surprised that you can get a good video like that from your phone, but you can. You just got to make sure it's set up in a way that it stays steady on the above your work. I have a better camera now, so I don't have the issue with the focus. It focusing on my hand rather than the work. I'm just deepening those shadows now. We use the blue and then the black. Paying a bit more attention to where I want the different shapes in the clouds to be. Which, if you see me pausing, that's usually because I'm looking at the photo I'm working from and thinking about how I want the shadows, the cloud shapes to be. They don't have to be exactly like the reference photo, and this one certainly isn't, but just sort of getting an idea of how they should look. I have the reference photo set up on a laptop next to where I'm working, so it's quite easy for me to just glance at it and then continue working. Adding a bit more detail into these little clouds. And just keeping my strokes as tight little circles, and that helps to get the texture that I want. The other reason to keep your strokes when you're trying to do little details as tight circles for this sort of work is it stops you from doing messy strokes everywhere and changing the direction. If you do little circles, then it keeps it a lot neater. So as you can see there, sometimes I don't always follow what I say and do a little bit of messy work, but it's not as important for some of these because these are clouds. They can be a little bit messy. the way you use your pencil, like the strokes, it just depends on what you're drawing. In fur, I always do little short strokes for short fur and longer strokes and have them always slightly curved. But for here, I'm using a lot more horizontal and little circles for the details on the clouds. Here I am starting to darken up that yellow area with the red. Yeah, I'm blending it all out once again. It is often with colour pencil, just rinse and repeat. Yes, just keep layering and then blending, then layering and blending. You just keep going. And because they're clouds, you can actually smudge the areas that you're blending out a bit, so you don't have to keep it really crisp. Other sort of things that you're drawing, you'd want to keep those lines a bit more crisp, so which is why you'd use a smaller brush than the one I'm using. But because they're clouds, it doesn't really matter if they're getting smudged a bit. You don't want to smudge the black completely into the yellow section, but smudging it a bit will make the clouds look softer. Using the white Polychromos to add a little bit of just to lighten the area in the yellow just a little bit. And covering the white with the yellow. That's something I do a fair bit. If I find an area needs to be lightened, sometimes it's easier to go over it with white and then with the colour pencil that you want it to actually be. Another layer of colour. This is what I keep doing, is layering those colours one on top of the other. I'm being quite rough with this layer because it's just a light layer to get a bit more vibrant colour on those clouds. Just making sure that that layer was nicely blended into the layers below it. Now, starting to sketch in that bottom landscape. And I just start with like a medium pressure of black, light to medium, not too heavy. Just trying to get an even coverage of the black all over. Not being too neat with my pencil strokes there, but just making sure that there's an even coverage. And this section is not so very interesting to watch. But sometimes it is good to know how people get the black color down, because often that's skipped across and you don't actually see what they do. It's sometimes hard to get a nice even coverage of black. And often I've found that you'll do like your layers of black and it'll look really nice. And then when you go back to it a day later, the black will look like it's faded a little bit, and you'll need to do another layer of black on top to just make it dark. And that's more important when you're trying to get a really intense dark area. Someone said that sometimes the pigment sort of gets absorbed a little bit into the paper or something. I'm not entirely sure why or what the reasoning behind all that is, but it's definitely what I've found is sometimes the black just need to go back again a day later and just darken it a bit more. There was one in particular piece that I had to keep doing that over and over, and it was driving me nuts. Just it was a picture I did of the wood nymph, and the dark areas around her face, just every time I went back to it, the black just seemed to have faded. I'm not entirely sure what the deal with that one was, but I just kept going back and adding more layers of black on top of the black areas. And with ocean, when you're drawing it, make sure that the line for the horizon of the ocean itself is straight and definitely horizontal. You definitely want it as horizontal as you can get, because if it's slightly off, and you hang up the picture, you'll see it and it'll look like the world's tipping slightly to one side. You want that line to be as horizontal as possible. And if you measure from the top of your page to that point when you initially do your drawing and actually draw that line in using a ruler, that's a good idea to do, to make sure that it's as horizontal as possible. Now I'm going over the black in one of the dark purpley reds. I find if you just do a layer of black and repeated layers of black, it will look flat. It won't look rich. With black, you really do need to have other colors included in it. And so I often do caput mortem or any of the dark blues or dark browns, or the reddy purples. Depends on the piece you're doing as to what sort of color you want the black to be. And you don't really notice it when you look at it initially, but if you leave it as just black, it does look very flat. And especially when you're doing a silhouette like that, it'll just not look like it's a part of the picture. I'm blending that all out now. Not so exciting, this part. You can see I'm doing tight circles with the brush to try and get the pigment to get into all the little white specks on the paper as much as possible. I'm also going to be careful not to blend it below that line either. I will adjust that line when I start doing the water to make sure that it's as horizontal as possible and to get the waves in, because that's water down below. But at this point, you don't want black smearing into the bottom part because that water is going to be quite reflective of the sunset above it. So it's going to be quite bright. And just keep blending it out until you get it to a nice smooth layer and smooth coverage. As you can see, when you've got too much on the brush, it does smear the black around a bit, which can be a bit annoying when you're trying to get a smooth coverage like I am for this section. And that's when you need to use less solvent on your brush. But then sometimes when you get to this point in the picture, you just want to finish this section. And now with that dark contrast in, I'm going over the sunset again and adding more colour in and seeing where it needs it. As you can see, that grey, those grey clouds at the top didn't stay very grey. They ended up a lot more coloured than I originally had them at. And at this point, I'm not looking at the reference photo. I'm just looking at my picture and seeing where I want the colour and how I want it to look. Now I'm going over the horizon again. At this point, I'm adjusting the actual edge of the landscape and sharpening that edge so that it doesn't look as blurry. Sometimes when you use the solvent with the brush, you can get a bit of a blurred edge. And so that's what I'm cleaning up at the moment. As you can see, my black pencil's getting a bit short. I need to get the extender out in a moment. Well, with this piece, you've actually got a bit of the light reflection in the top left corner, and that's actually washing out the picture a little bit from what it actually looked like. So just bear that in mind when you're looking at it. You can see it reflecting on some of the black pencil quite obviously. And with landscapes, you just and rocks like this, you make sure that it just looks nice and random. Don't do too many sort of square lines or anything. You just little bumps and knobs and weird bits sticking out. Sometimes it helps to just look at pictures of rocks and see how they look when they don't have to be silhouetted. You just look at how they look naturally and just sort of copy their random shapes. Now I'm going to do another layer of black over that whole bottom section. As you can see, it's like one layer of black and the dark red purple is not enough to give a proper coverage. And for this, I'm starting to press a lot harder, and that just helps to get that pigment onto the page without having to do heaps of layers. However, you do have to be careful when you press harder because you will damage the tooth of the paper. In this section, it doesn't matter because I want that whole section black, and I know that's what I want. But if you are pressing too hard in other areas, you do have to be careful because it can actually stop you from being able to do multiple layers. As you can see from how blunt my pencil's going to how hard I'm actually pushing. Not burnishing. I don't tend to burnish at all. Burnishing is when you push so hard that the tooth of the paper is completely flattened. I don't press that hard because that actually hurts my wrist. So I don't actually like using too much pressure. I prefer to use lighter pressure and then just add more layers when needed. The only times when I push hard is usually at this sort of thing. And usually I'll have to sit afterwards and hold my wrist because it'll be a bit sore. And that's something to keep in mind if you do find that you are getting wrist pain or hand pain or cramps when drawing. Think about how hard you're pushing and pressing your pencil onto the paper. Maybe you need to do lighter layers. And also do keep in mind that you may need to do lots of stretching of your hands and relax those muscles in between layers and when they're getting sore. The last thing you want to do is actually give yourself a hand injury, which can happen. You don't want to do that. Now I'm blending that out. I'm being a lot more careful. On back to that point about injuries, that's one of the reasons why I love using the solvent is because you don't need to press hard to get the paper to look better without the white flecks of paper texture showing through. You can get that without pushing very hard at all. The solvent helps with that, and that's one of the reasons why I love this technique. Now being very careful around the edge of the rocks with the brush. I don't want to end up smearing it and making it blurry, otherwise I'll have to go over that edge line again. If I was going for like a black shadowed area where it had to be perfectly smooth, I'd be a lot more careful with how much solvent I was using, because they are rocks and they will catch a little bit of light, even though they are silhouettes. I'm not that worried about if there's little spots where it's a bit lighter than the other areas. And there you go. That's how I created the sunset for this particular picture beneath the waves. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial and thank you for supporting me on Patreon. I really appreciate it. Bye for now.